The chamber did not echo. That was the first thing I noticed. Every voice, every shuffling movement, every whispered translation from a dozen alien mouths simply vanished into the walls, swallowed by a room so large it had its own weather system near the ceiling. I, Kalen Sir, junior diplomatic attaché for the planet Earth, stood in the overflow gallery and tried not to look as small as I felt. The overflow gallery. Not the main floor. Not even the visitors' balcony. The overflow gallery, where they seated uninvited press and malfunctioning translation units that nobody had gotten around to repairing. There was a soundproofing screen between us and the council floor, a thin barrier of shimmering blue light that reduced the voices of the most powerful species in the known galaxy to a faint, polite murmur. Senior Ambassador Marcus Webb stood next to me. He was 67 years old, with the posture of a man who had spent 45 years learning how to make himself seem smaller so that rooms full of aliens would not feel threatened. He had done this job longer than I had been alive. Right now, he was watching the council floor with eyes that gave nothing away. I watched it too. I had no choice. The Galactic Council chambers were located on the station known as the Convergence Point, a structure so old that its original builders had gone extinct before humanity had learned to make fire. The main floor was a perfect circle, and around it, in rising tiers, sat the delegations of 17 recognized species. Each tier was color-coded to the homeworld of its occupants. Each delegation had direct floor access, real-time translation feeds, voting consoles embedded in their seats, and refreshments tailored to their specific biology. Earth's delegation had a folding table and a pitcher of water. I had been told before I arrived that the Galactic Council operated on the principle of graduated recognition. Species were ranked by criteria including age of civilization, technological consistency, interstellar reach, and what the Council called civilizational stability. Earth had applied for full recognition 11 years ago. We had been granted provisional observer status, which meant we could attend sessions, submit written comments after the fact, and be present in the overflow gallery behind the soundproofing screen. It meant nothing. It was designed to mean nothing. The session had been called to discuss routine resource allocation along the Outer Belt, a stretch of contested mining territory near the edge of the Veth Dominion space. The Veth were the oldest recognized species in the Council, and they behaved accordingly. Their tier was at the top of the circle, physically elevated above everyone else. Their lead delegate, a tall figure named Councillor Thavik of the primary branch, spoke with the measured calm of someone who had never once been told no. I watched him table a motion. It was not about resource allocation. It was about Earth. The motion was 19 paragraphs long. Our translation unit, the one functioning device we had been allocated, rendered it with a 5-second delay and a faint buzzing in the upper registers that made it sound like it was being read by someone who found the whole thing mildly amusing. The core of it was this: the Veth Dominion, citing a review of Earth's civilizational record over the prior 2 centuries, was formally proposing that Earth be reclassified from provisional observer to pre-rational species status. Pre-rational. I had read that term in a history file once. It was the classification used for species that had not yet demonstrated, in the Council's judgment, the capacity for self-governance at an interstellar level. It stripped observer status entirely. It removed Earth from any treaty framework. It meant that any council member could legally operate within Earth's solar system without seeking consent, provided they filed a courtesy notice within 30 standard days. A courtesy notice. Ambassador Webb did not move. He stood with his hands behind his back and watched the council vote. The vote was 17-1. The one dissenter was a small amphibious species called the Merith, who had joined the council only 70 years ago and still seemed faintly surprised to be included in anything. Their delegate voted no, and then immediately looked at the table, as if hoping no one had noticed. Councillor Thavik did not look up at the overflow gallery. That was the most precise version of the insult. Not that he looked at us with contempt, but that he did not look at us at all. The broadcast went live across the galaxy within the hour. Thavik's counterpart from the Veth delegation, a junior figure named Sorvath, made a brief statement to the press cluster waiting at the chamber exits. Sorvath said that the reclassification was a compassionate measure, one designed to give Earth the time and support it needed to reach genuine civilizational maturity. He said the Council held no ill will toward humans. He said it with the tone of someone explaining to a child why they were not allowed to hold the sharp tool. The press asked several questions. None of them were directed at Webb. I was standing 2 steps behind him when the press cluster thinned out and the corridor emptied. The translation unit in my pocket had gone silent. The session was over. The vote was logged. The resolution was already propagating through every diplomatic channel in known space. Webb turned to look at me. His expression had not changed once in the last 5 hours. "Write your report," he said. "Yes, sir." He walked toward the transport bay. I stood in the corridor for a moment, watching the last of the alien delegations filter out around me. Tall forms and short ones, scaled and smooth, some walking, some moving in ways that had no word in any human language. None of them looked at me. Not one. I took out my communications pad and opened a channel to the Earth relay station. The message was short. Protocol required only a brief acknowledgement that the session had concluded and that I had witnessed the outcome firsthand. I typed one word, "Received." I sent it. Then I put the pad away and walked to the transport bay. I did not run. I did not look back. I made very sure that my face, at every moment, gave absolutely nothing away. 72 hours passed. Earth said nothing. I know how that sounds. I know that in the context of galactic diplomacy, 72 hours is not a long time. The Veth had once spent 14 years debating a border notation before issuing a formal response. But Earth was a human civilization, and humans were loud, reactive, emotional creatures who issued press releases within minutes of any perceived slight and then argued publicly about whether the press release had been worded strongly enough. That was what the galaxy expected. That was what the galaxy had always seen. So when Earth went completely silent, no statement, no protest, no diplomatic communique, no press conference, no leaked document, no anonymous source, the absence of sound was so total that it became a kind of pressure. I felt it in the corridor outside the Earth delegation's assigned quarters on Convergence Point Station. I felt it every time I walked past a cluster of alien delegates and heard the whisper, equivalent in their respective languages. Curiosity at first. Then mockery. Then something else. Something quieter and less comfortable. On the first day, Sorvath of the Veth delegation passed me near the communications hub. He paused long enough to say that the Council was prepared to expedite Earth's transition into the pre-rational support framework if we wished to begin voluntary compliance immediately. He said the word voluntary with complete confidence that it did not need examination. I said, "I'll pass that along." He moved on. I kept walking. On the second day, a delegation aide from the Marath, the one species that had voted no, left a small unsigned data chip on the table outside our quarters. I checked it. It contained nothing but a brief audio file, a Marath phrase that translated roughly as, "The river does not answer the stone." I sat with that for a while. Ambassador Webb spent most of those 72 hours in his private room with the door closed. He emerged for meals, ate without speaking, and returned. I had worked with him for 4 years. I had never seen him sleep less, or talk less, or sit more still. He reminded me of a man listening very hard to something just below the range of normal hearing. I found myself thinking about my grandmother, whose name was Helen. She had grown up in a small port town on the northern coast of England. She had a habit, whenever someone underestimated her, of going very quiet. Not cold. Quiet. She would listen to everything the other person said, nodding at the right moments. And then, when they had fully committed to the belief that she was no threat at all, she would move. She had told me once that the most dangerous thing a person could do when someone pushed them was to push back immediately. Immediate reaction gave the other person information. Patience, real patience, gave you everything. I had not thought about Helen in years. I thought about her constantly during those 72 hours. On the third day, 2 things happened. The first was a summons, not a formal diplomatic summons, an informal one, which was somehow more insulting. Sorvath had sent a personal message asking me to meet him in one of the station's open common areas, a large lounge near the upper transit ring, where various delegation members gathered to exchange the kind of conversation that was too informal for session record but too deliberate to be called casual. I went. Sorvath was already there when I arrived. Seated at a low table with a drink he did not appear to be actually consuming. He was a lean figure, his eyes a pale gold, with the patient quality of someone who had never once been uncertain about the outcome of anything. He told me, in a tone he clearly intended to be kind, that Earth had a choice. The pre-rational classification was not a punishment, he said. It was a structure. Structures existed to support those who were not yet ready to support themselves. He said that the compliance addendum, a document I had not yet seen, would formalize Earth's acceptance of the new framework and lay out a review process for reclassification in approximately 40 years, provided Earth met certain behavioral benchmarks. 40 years, he said. It will hurt less if you sign now. He said it the way someone says it when they are not particularly concerned about whether it hurts at all. I looked at him across the table. I kept my face calm. I had been practicing calm for 3 days. I said, "Thank you for the meeting." Then I stood up and left. The second thing that happened on the third day was the encrypted transmission. It arrived at 19 minutes past the second station hour, somewhere in the middle of what my body still insisted on calling night. It came through a channel I had not used before, not the standard diplomatic relay, but a secondary protocol that I had been given during my initial mission briefing and told to monitor but not expect to use. It was labeled with my name and marked, "Eyes Only." The sender was the Office of the Secretary-General of Earth. The file was called Protocol 0. I sat down on the edge of my bunk and opened it. I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I laughed, a real laugh, sudden and sharp, and immediately pressed my hand over my mouth because the walls on the station were thin and the last thing I needed was for anyone outside to hear a human laughing in the dark. The laugh was not from humor. It was from recognition. The feeling of a puzzle piece finding its place after you had been staring at the wrong part of the picture for so long you had forgotten what the full image was supposed to look like. I understood now why Webb had been so still. He had known, not the specifics perhaps, but the shape of it. The silence had not been grief. It had not been surrender. It had been math. Earth, despite every reputation it had ever earned for impulsiveness and noise, had spent 72 hours doing math so precise and so comprehensive that reading the results in that dim room on a station that had just finished humiliating my species in front of the entire galaxy made me feel something I had not expected. I felt ready. The notification went out at exactly the time it was supposed to. I delivered it myself. Webb had made that decision the night before, after we spoke for 3 hours about Protocol 0 in his room with every signal dampening setting on our equipment running at full capacity. He had looked older that night, but not tired. There is a difference, and it matters. He had looked at me across the small table and said, "You'll be the one in the room when this lands. I need someone who can watch their faces and not react." He had looked at me carefully when he said that. I had said I wouldn't react. He had believed me. I think he believed me because I had spent 3 days practicing. So at the beginning of the 4th morning on Convergence Point Station, I walked to the Council's Diplomatic Processing Center and submitted 17 formal notifications simultaneously, one for each recognized species in the Galactic Council. Each notification was identical in its legal language, customized only in the recipient's address. Each one had been drafted by a team of Earth's senior legal architects over the course of 65 of the 72 silent hours. Each one had been reviewed 5 times. Earth was voiding every standing treaty, trade agreement, resource-sharing compact, non-aggression declaration, and diplomatic framework it held with any member of the Galactic Council. All of them at once. Effective at midnight Galactic Standard Time, approximately 14 hours away. I submitted the documents, signed the receipt forms, accepted the processing confirmation codes, and walked out. It took about 13 minutes for the Council's administrative system to route the notifications to their respective recipients. It took another 6 minutes for the responses to start arriving. The first was from a mid-tier council species called the Preth, whose delegate sent a message that consisted almost entirely of untranslatable sounds that my unit rendered as, "This is irregular." The second was from the Veth Dominion, not Thavik, not Sorvath, but a senior administrative figure whose name translated roughly as Keeper of the Fourth Record. It indicated a level of bureaucratic seniority significant enough that receiving a message from them was meant to imply that the situation had escalated beyond the diplomatic layer entirely. The message said that Earth's notification was without legal standing under the pre-rational reclassification. As a pre-rational species, Earth was not recognized as a treaty party, and therefore could not void treaties it was not considered to formally hold. I read that message twice. Then I forwarded it to Webb with a single line attached, "They just told us we don't have treaties to cancel." Webb's response came back in 30 seconds, "Let them hold that position." I was still processing what that meant when the second component of Protocol 0 activated. It was not a document. It was not a notification. It was a transmission, a public, open, galaxy-wide broadcast originating from Earth's primary deep space relay hub and targeted at every non-council species, independent colony, fringe system, and unaffiliated trader network in known space. The broadcast was 26 minutes long. I watched the first 5 minutes of it on my pad in the corridor outside the processing center before the hall around me became too loud to concentrate. Delegates and aides from a dozen species were spilling out of their quarters and gathering in clusters, reading their own devices, speaking rapidly in their own languages, and occasionally looking up with expressions I had learned to read well enough to translate without a machine. Surprise. Genuine surprise. Not the polite, performative surprise of a council in session, but the sharp, slightly unsteady expression of someone who had just looked at a situation they thought they understood and realized they had been looking at the wrong part of it the entire time. The broadcast contained 3 things. The first was a formal announcement that Earth was establishing direct bilateral relationships with 37 non-council species and 22 independent systems, effective immediately. These were not casual partnerships. They were full trade agreements, mutual aid frameworks, and technology-sharing compacts that had been quietly negotiated over the prior 14 months, conducted through diplomatic backchannels and private relays that had been invisible to the Council because no Council member had thought to look for them. No one had thought to look, because no one had imagined that Earth would ever have a reason to build something outside the Council's framework. The second was an open-source data package. 5 human technologies, which Galactic markets had assumed were restricted and heavily licensed, were released without cost to any non-council world that registered to receive them. The first was an atmospheric terraforming system using engineered microorganisms. The second was a high-density neural storage format. The third was a method for processing void-class radiation. The fourth was a modular shipbuilding framework. The fifth was a universal translation algorithm that worked without prior linguistic data. The releases were free for everyone except the 17 council member species. The third part of the broadcast was brief. It was a single statement read by the Secretary-General of Earth in a calm voice, acknowledging the Galactic Council's recent vote, noting that Earth respected the Council's authority over its own membership and its own framework, and announcing that Earth had therefore chosen to operate outside that framework going forward. The statement expressed no anger. It contained no demands. It used no language that could be quoted as a threat. It was, in its own way, the most precise communication I had ever heard a human being deliver. The response from the council floor was not precise. It was not calm. Within 2 hours of the broadcast, the council had called an emergency session, their first in 14 years. I was not invited. Our overflow gallery access had technically been revoked by the reclassification vote. I watched the session through a public feed on my pad, seated in the corner of the station's smallest common room, eating a protein block that tasted like nothing and needed no attention. Councillor Thavik spoke for 45 minutes. I watched his face more than I listened to the translation. He was controlled, they were always controlled, but there was something at the edges of his expression that I had not seen there before. He called it a tantrum. He said it confidently, that this was a predictable human response to correction, emotional and disproportionate, and that the Council should not dignify it with alarm. He said that without Council trade routes, technology licensing networks, and diplomatic cover, Earth would find itself isolated and economically unsustainable within a decade. He said this as a statement of fact, not a threat. Several council members around him nodded in the practiced way of people who agree with something because they have not yet had enough time to think about whether it is actually true. I ate my protein block. I watched the session. I waited. 4 hours after Thavik's speech, I received a movement alert from the station's public navigation feed. A Veth fleet had repositioned to the edge of monitored space, not inside any treaty boundary, because at this point there were no treaty boundaries to speak of, but close enough that the position could not be read as anything other than a statement. I looked at the sensor feed for a long moment. Then I thought, good. They were emotional now. Moving on instinct. Sending the fleet out as a visible show of strength because visible shows of strength were what you did when the ground had shifted in a way you had not expected and you needed something solid to stand on. And emotional, I had learned from my grandmother, from 4 years under web, from 72 hours of silence that had felt like learning to breathe underwater, was the one condition in which humans were better prepared than almost any species in the galaxy. Because humans had been emotional their entire history. They had built every system they had, every treaty structure, every conflict protocol, every negotiation framework, specifically to account for the fact that they were emotional. They had stress-tested their institutions against their own worst impulses for centuries. The Veth had never had to do that. They had always been calm. They had always been in control. They did not know what to do when control was not available. I set the sensor feed aside and opened the second component of the Protocol 0 file. The Part 1 had not yet read, labeled Phase 2, for use after broadcast. I read it carefully. Then I stood up, put my pad in my pocket, and walked toward the council chambers with a particular kind of steadiness that comes not from having no fear, but from having decided very clearly what you are going to do next. I had never spoken on a council floor before. That was technically still true. The summons that came at the end of the fourth day was not an invitation to speak. It was a formal order to appear and answer questions. There is a difference, legally and procedurally, and the Veth were very careful about that distinction. They phrased it as an inquiry. They called me the Earth representative, not ambassador, because ambassador implied a standing that they had already voted to remove. I appeared alone. Webb had offered to come with me. I told him it would be better if he did not. He had looked at me for a long moment and then said, "All right," in a tone that told me he agreed, but was also making very sure that I understood the weight of what I was walking into. I understood the weight. The council floor felt different when you were on it rather than above it. Standing in the center circle, surrounded by 17 tiers of alien delegations arranged above you in a perfect ring, the light coming down from a source somewhere in that engineered ceiling and hitting the floor at an angle that made you feel both very visible and very alone. It was designed to communicate something. It had been designed, probably by the Veth, to make whoever stood in that circle feel the full geometry of their situation. I stood in the center circle. I looked up. Counselor Thavik looked down at me with the expression of someone performing patience. He said that Earth had taken actions which, while not legally coherent given Earth's current classification, had nonetheless caused disruption to several Council-adjacent systems and relationships. He said the Council was extending the opportunity, he used the word opportunity, for Earth's representative to clarify the intention behind those actions, so that the Council could respond appropriately. It was a kind of offer. The kind of offer you make when you believe the other party has no options, and you want to give them a clean way to acknowledge that so you can move forward without the mess of prolonged resistance. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, "I'd like to read something into the record." There was a pause. Technically, my status did not allow me to formally read anything into the council record. Thavik's people had prepared for that. They had a procedural response queued up. I could see it in the slight shift of the administrative aide seated to Thavik's right, the way his hand moved toward his console. But then the Mareth delegate, the small amphibious figure who had voted no, said quietly from her tier, "Point of process. The subject of this inquiry is present and has the floor. The floor should speak." It was not quite a legal argument, but it was a procedural fact, and the council operated on procedural facts the way a machine operates on fuel. Thavik could have overridden it. Overriding it would have required a floor vote, which would have taken time, during which I would still be standing in the center circle, and the session would have been on record as the moment the council voted to silence the subject of its own inquiry. He did not override it. "Thank you," I said. I meant it. I looked briefly at the Mareth delegate. Her species did not have the facial musculature for smiling, but her eyes moved in a way that I had come to understand meant something similar. I took out my pad. I want to start with the record. The Council's own record, which is a matter of public documentation available to any species regardless of classification status. I had prepared for this. I had spent parts of every one of those 72 hours preparing for this specific moment, which I had not been certain would come but had considered possible. I had gone through the Council session archives, 17 years of them, which was as far back as our translation systems could reliably render, and pulled every official comment, every procedural note, every floor speech that referenced Earth by name. There were 317 of them. I read the most relevant 41. I read them in order by timestamp, starting from the earliest. I did not editorialize. I did not raise my voice. I simply read, clearly and without rush, what the Council's own members had said about Earth and about humans in the formal record of their official sessions over 17 years. The words described us as a volatile species. They described us as short-lived and therefore poor long-term planning partners. They described our political systems as chaotic. They described our emotional nature as a liability. They described our rate of technological development as erratic. They used the word primitive 11 times across the record, always attached to qualifiers that were clearly intended to soften it without removing its meaning. The chamber was completely quiet by the time I finished. I set my pad down. I want to be clear about something, I said. Earth has understood from the beginning that this was the Council's assessment. We knew. We were told, directly and indirectly, in session and outside of it, in diplomatic exchanges and in the silence after them. We knew. I looked up at Thavik. We used that time. The time when you were watching us and expecting us to fail, we used it. While the Council was deciding what level of classification to assign us, Earth was building something. Not in response to the vote. The vote was not a surprise. It was the reason we started building, 11 years ago, when we filed for full recognition and received in return a folding table and a pitcher of water. There was a sound from somewhere in the tiers, something shifting in a seat, or perhaps an intake of breath. I continued. The 37 non-Council species and 22 independent systems now aligned with Earth. Those relationships were not built in 72 hours. They were built over 4 years of quiet outreach, through channels that were entirely legal and entirely below the threshold of anything the Council monitors. Because the Council does not monitor conversations between provisional observers and non-recognized worlds. We are grateful for that oversight. I paused. The coalition that those partnerships have produced, the Alliance of Independent Worlds, which will hold its inaugural formal session within the next 30 days, has a current combined economic output larger than the bottom 7 members of this Council. It controls, through independent transit agreements now in effect, access to 5 of the 9 primary resource extraction zones in the Outer Belt. The Outer Belt. The same Outer Belt that had been the stated subject of the session in which Earth had been reclassified, the one the Council had been discussing before they paused to deal with us. I did not point that out. I did not need to. Regarding the technology releases, I said, those were not all of our restricted access research. They were selected specifically because they address problems that non-Council worlds have been trying to solve for decades, and because the Council had those solutions in reach through licensing agreements with Earth that have now been voided. The remaining research library, which is substantially larger, is available for partnership negotiation with any member of the Alliance of Independent Worlds. I let that land. I watched it land. I watched 17 delegations absorb the arithmetic of it in real time. Then I said the last part. Finally, the faster-than-light relay network that the Veth Dominion currently operates, that every species in this chamber pays transit and communication fees to use. Earth has completed an alternative. It has been in development for 8 years. It is functional. It covers 68% of the same route network currently controlled by the Dominion's relay system. It is being made available to Alliance members at no charge. The silence after that was different from the silence after the vote. The vote silence had been the silence of finality, of a door closing. This silence was the silence of a room in which every person had just simultaneously realized that the ground had changed under their feet, and none of them had felt it happen. Councillor Thavik looked at me for the first time in 4 days. He actually looked at me. I straightened my jacket. It was a simple Earth issue jacket, standard diplomatic gray, slightly wrinkled from 4 days of continuous wear. I had not changed it. I had thought about changing it that morning and decided against it. We do not want to dissolve the Galactic Council, I said. We do not want conflict. What we want is to be treated as a species with standing agency, the right to participate in the decisions that affect our world and our future, without apology, and without being told to wait 40 years to be reviewed. I looked around the chamber. You wanted us out of your framework. We built our own. It is larger than you expected. It will continue to grow. And the offer to rejoin a shared framework, one built on equal standing, without civilizational classification hierarchies, is open. It will remain open. Because that is the kind of species we are. I picked up my pad. That concludes my remarks. I was halfway back to the corridor when the first of the council delegations broke into what their species used instead of applause. I did not look back to see which one it was. Behind me, though, I heard the sound spread, tier by tier, up the circle. The applause did not last. It could not. The council chamber was not built for approval, it was built for procedure, and procedure demanded that the session continue. But something had shifted. I felt it in the way the Marith delegate leaned forward in her seat. I saw it in the way several council members, including some from the Veth Dominion's allied factions, began conferring in voices too low for the translation units to catch. Councillor Thavik called for a recess. It was the first time in the session that his voice had carried anything other than absolute certainty. The recess was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 4. I spent those 4 hours in a small consultation room off the main corridor, seated across from Webb, who had arrived with a fresh pot of coffee and the particular expression of a man who had been proven right but was too professional to say so. "They're scared," Webb said. "Not of the fleet. They never were. They're scared of the math. You gave them numbers they can't argue with and a framework they didn't see coming. That's worse than any weapon." I poured coffee into a cup that had been washed so many times the logo had faded to a pale ghost. "How many will follow?" Webb pulled up a list on his pad. "The Marith are already drafting associate membership papers. The Preth are waiting to see which way the wind blows. Another day, maybe 2. The smaller council members are the ones to watch. They've been paying Veth transit fees for centuries. If we can offer them a cheaper alternative, they'll switch within the year." "And the Veth themselves?" Webb was quiet for a moment. "They'll hold out longest. They built the system. Admitting it needs to change is admitting they were wrong to build it that way in the first place. That kind of admission takes time." He looked at me. "But they'll come. Not because they want to, because the alternative is watching the galaxy reorganize itself without them." I thought about that. I thought about the fleet that had turned back, the anonymous inquiry portal, the junior delegate who had brought me tea and a threat dressed as kindness. The Veth were proud. Proud empires did not bend easily. But empires that refused to bend eventually broke. I finished my coffee. The recess was ending. The session resumed with a different tone. The Veth still controlled the floor, but their control had become defensive. They were responding now, not leading. Thavik read a prepared statement acknowledging Earth's alternative framework and announcing that the Council would establish a review committee to assess the implications for existing treaty structures. The statement took 7 minutes. It said nothing of substance. When Thavik finished, the Marith delegate requested the floor. She stood, a small figure, barely visible behind her tiers railing, and spoke for less than 2 minutes. Her words, translated through the Council system, were direct. The Marith Confederation recognizes the Alliance of Independent Worlds as a legitimate diplomatic body. We request formal observer status in the Alliance's inaugural session. The chamber stirred. Thavik's mandibles clicked, a Veth expression of displeasure that needed no translation. But he did not object. He could not. The Marith were a recognized council member, and what they did outside council sessions was their own affair. I looked at Webb. He was already typing. The session ended 3 hours later. No further votes were taken. No resolutions were passed. The council had entered what its procedures called deliberative pause, a state of suspended motion that could last days or weeks or, in theory, years. It was the mechanism the council used when it needed time to recalibrate. I walked back to our quarters through corridors that felt different. The alien delegates who passed me did not look away. Some of them nodded. One, a representative from a mid-tier species I did not recognize, stopped me to ask where she could find the application form for Alliance Observer status. I gave her Webb's contact information. She thanked me and moved on. That night, I stood at the observation window of our quarters, watching the station turn against the stars. Below me, the council chamber was dark. The tiers were empty. The soundproofing screen that had separated the overflow gallery from the main floor was still active, shimmering faintly in the artificial twilight. I thought about the vote. The 17-to-1 humiliation. The folding table and the pitcher of water. The word received, typed into a pad in a corridor where no one looked at me. I thought about what it felt like to be told, formally, finally, in front of the entire galaxy, That you were not ready, not recognized, not rational enough to sit at the table where your own future was being decided. And then I thought about what humans did with that feeling. Not rage. Not collapse. Not the kind of quiet acceptance that looked like peace. We remembered it. Exactly. Filed it somewhere precise and permanent. And got to work. We did not stop. The Alliance of Independent Worlds held its inaugural session 31 days later. The station was not finished, walls were bare in some sections, and the life support system had a habit of humming at a frequency that gave some delegates headaches, but the central chamber was complete. A ring of seats, identical in height and width and sight lines, arranged in a perfect circle. No tiers. No elevation. No overflow gallery. Every delegation sat at the same level. Every voice carried the same distance. I sat in Earth's seat, indistinguishable from every other seat in the room. Beside me, Webb was reviewing the agenda. Across the circle, the Marith delegate was conferring with representatives from 3 other newly associated systems. The atmosphere was not formal. It was not ceremonial. It was something quieter and more durable, the atmosphere of people who had work to do and had decided to do it together. The first order of business was a vote on the charter. It passed unanimously. The second order of business was a vote on Earth's permanent seat at the table. It also passed unanimously, though the Marith delegate noted for the record that Earth's seat was, structurally, exactly the same as everyone else's. "That's the point," I said. She inclined her head, her species equivalent of a smile. The session continued for 3 days. We discussed trade routes, resource sharing, mutual defense, and the open-source technology library. We argued. We compromised. We built. It was not glamorous. It was not heroic. It was the slow, patient work of constructing something that had not existed before. By the end of the 3rd day, the Alliance had grown to 41 member species and 27 independent systems. The Veth had not applied. The Marith had filed a formal request to host the next session on their home world. Webb and I walked back to our quarters together. The station's corridors were quiet. Through the observation windows, the stars were the same stars that had watched humanity take its first steps into space, that had watched us fail and falter and fight, that had watched us refuse to stop. "Ambassador," Webb said. It was the first time he had called me that. "You did good work." "We did good work," I said. He nodded. Then he opened the door to his quarters and disappeared inside. I stood in the corridor for a moment longer. Then I pulled out my pad and sent a message to the office of the Secretary-General of Earth. It was brief, a single line, the same line I had typed 72 days ago in a different corridor on a different station. Received. I sent it. Then I turned off the pad and walked to the observation window. The station's rotation brought Earth into view, a blue and white marble hanging against the black. Small. Fragile. Unmistakable. We had not wanted to rule the galaxy. We had just wanted to stop being told we could not sit at the table. So we had built our own. The galaxy was watching. The galaxy was learning. And somewhere out there, in the vast dark between stars, the old council was still deliberating. But their deliberations no longer mattered. The door had been open for years. They had simply refused to walk through it. Now the door was still open, but the room had moved. I turned away from the window and walked back to my quarters. Tomorrow there would be more work. There was always more work. That was not a burden. That was a gift. The Alliance of Independent Worlds had its first crisis within 6 months. A border dispute between 2 member systems, neither of them human, escalated to the point of armed standoff. The Council, still mired in its deliberative pause, offered no assistance. The Alliance resolved it in 3 weeks through a mediation framework that Webb had drafted in his first year as ambassador, before the vote, before the humiliation, before any of us knew whether the framework would ever be used. It worked. The dispute ended. The systems involved signed a new boundary agreement and, at the suggestion of the Marith delegate, named the document after Webb. He did not attend the signing ceremony. He was in a hospital on Earth, receiving treatment for a condition that had gone undiagnosed for years, the kind of condition that developed slowly, without obvious symptoms, until it was nearly too late. I visited him between sessions. He looked smaller than I remembered. The posture that had made him seem less threatening to alien delegations had become something else, the posture of a man conserving strength. "Did they name it correctly?" he asked. "The Web Accords," I said. "It's official. The Alliance Charter has it in the annex." He closed his eyes for a moment. "Good," he said. "It was always going to be useful. Just needed the right moment." He died 3 weeks later. The Mareth delegate attended the funeral, the first time a non-human had set foot on Earth in an official diplomatic capacity since the reclassification vote. She stood at the back of the ceremony, silent, her eyes moving in that way I had learned to understand. Afterward, she approached me. "Ambassador Oren," she said, "the river does not answer the stone. But the river continues." I did not have a response. I did not need one. The Web Accords are still in force. The Alliance of Independent Worlds has grown to include 63 species and 41 independent systems. The Galactic Council has not dissolved, but it no longer matters the way it once did. Its sessions are sparsely attended. Its resolutions are ignored. Its tiers are empty. The Veth Dominion never applied for Alliance membership. But the anonymous inquiry portal receives messages from Veth Space every week, some from junior officials, some from mid-level administrators, some from sources we cannot trace. They ask about the application process. They ask about the technology library. They ask about the relay network. They do not ask about forgiveness. They are not ready for that. But they are asking questions, and questions, I have learned, are the beginning of everything. I am still the Earth representative to the Alliance. I sit in the same seat I sat in on the first day, indistinguishable from every other seat in the room. The folding table is in storage somewhere. The pitcher of water is long gone. I keep the translation unit in my pocket. It still has a faint buzz in the upper registers. I have never bothered to fix it. It reminds me of where we started. And where we started, a folding table, a pitcher of water, a soundproofing screen, a vote that was over before we stood up, is the only thing that makes the rest of it mean anything. We did not win. Winning is for battles. We built something, slowly, quietly, against the weight of a galaxy that had decided we did not belong. We built it with math and patience and the stubborn refusal to stop. The galaxy noticed. The galaxy is still noticing. And somewhere, in a small port town on the northern coast of England, a woman named Helen is probably smiling. She knew. She always knew. The river continues. We continue. That is enough. That is everything. The Alliance of Independent Worlds held its 5th annual session on a station built from salvaged parts, orbiting a star that had no name in any council language. The station was not finished. It would never be finished because that was not how we built things. We built them to grow. We built them to change. We built them to outlast us. I stood at the observation window, watching the delegations arrive. Ships from 63 species, ranging from sleek diplomatic vessels to cargo haulers that had been retrofitted with passenger seats. The Mareth delegation arrived first. They always arrived first, their small amphibious forms moving with the quiet efficiency of creatures who had learned to be early to every meeting because no one waited for them in the old council. The Veth were not here. They would never be here. But their inquiries continued, a steady stream of questions about technology licensing, relay access, and the application process that no one in the Dominion would officially acknowledge. The anonymous portal had processed over 4,000 messages in the past year. We answered every one. Ambassador. My aide, a young woman named Soraya, appeared at my elbow. The council session is ready to begin. They're waiting for you. They don't need to wait for me. The circle works the same whether I'm in my seat or not. She smiled. She had been born the year Earth filed for full council recognition, the year we received a folding table and a pitcher of water. She had grown up in the silence between the vote and the broadcast, in the years when the galaxy watched us and expected us to fail. She did not remember that time the way I did. She had been raised in the Alliance. She had never known a table where she was not welcome. They want to hear from you, she said. It's the 5th anniversary. You were there at the beginning. I turned away from the window. We were all there at the beginning. The beginning was a folding table in a corridor where no one looked at us. I walked toward the chamber. The corridor was lined with flags from Alliance member worlds, each one different, each one representing a species that had been told at some point that they were not ready, not recognized, not rational enough to sit at the table. The flags did not fly in any particular order. That was intentional. Order implied hierarchy, and hierarchy was what we had left behind. The chamber was a ring. No tiers, no elevation, no overflow gallery. Delegates from 63 species sat in identical seats, facing each other across a circular floor. The light came from windows, not from an engineered ceiling, windows that looked out at the stars we had all traveled to reach. I took my seat. It was indistinguishable from every other seat in the room. That was the point. The Marith delegate opened the session. She was older now, her movements slower, her eyes clouded with the film of age. But her voice was steady. She spoke for 5 minutes about the history of the Alliance, about the species who had built it, about the work that remained. Then she turned to me. Ambassador Oren. The floor recognizes Earth. I stood. I did not have notes. I had prepared remarks, but I had set them aside that morning. Something about the light through the windows, the curve of the ring, the quiet hum of the station's life support, it made prepared remarks feel wrong. I want to tell you about a corridor, I said. A corridor on a station called the Convergence Point. It was wide and cold and lit with a blue light that made everyone look slightly ill. I stood in that corridor for 72 hours, waiting for the galaxy to tell us what we already knew, that they did not want us at their table. I paused. The chamber was silent. They told us we were pre-rational. They told us we were not ready. They told us that if we waited 40 years and behaved ourselves, they might reconsider. And then a junior delegate from the Veth Dominion brought me tea and said it would hurt less if we signed now. I looked around the ring, at the Marith delegate, at the representatives from the outer systems who had been the first to respond to Earth's outreach, at the faces of species I had never imagined I would sit beside when I was standing in that corridor with a malfunctioning translation unit in my pocket. We did not sign. We did not wait. We did not behave. We built this. I gestured to the ring, to the windows, to the flags hanging in the corridor behind us. We built it because there was no other choice. We built it because the alternative was accepting a verdict that we knew, was wrong. And we built it together, not because we were stronger or smarter or better than anyone else, but because we were the ones who had been told no. I sat down. The silence held for a moment longer. Then the Marith delegate began to speak again, moving on to the next item on the agenda. That was the thing about the Alliance. The speeches did not go on forever. The work did. The work was the point. The session continued for 3 days. We discussed trade routes, resource allocation, and a proposal to establish a joint medical research initiative on a neutral world. We argued about the wording of a climate accord for 3 hours. We compromised. We moved on. On the final day, the Marith delegate announced that she was retiring. Her species had a lifespan shorter than humans, and she had given 40 years of her life to diplomacy, first in the Old Council, where her vote had been dismissed, then in the Alliance, where her voice carried the same weight as everyone else's. "Who will take your seat?" I asked. She looked at me with those clouded eyes. "Someone younger. Someone who does not remember the Old Council. That is how it should be." After the session closed, I walked to the observation window one last time. The station's rotation brought Earth into view, small and blue and distant. Somewhere on that planet, in a small port town on the northern coast of England, a woman named Helen was probably drinking tea and watching the waves. She was 97 years old now. She had outlived her husband, most of her friends, and the entire Galactic Council's relevance to human affairs. She had not outlived the work. The work continued. I pulled out my pad. The message was brief, addressed to the office of the Secretary-General of Earth, the same office that had sent me Protocol 0 5 years ago. The 5th session is complete. The Alliance is stronger than ever. The Old Council has not dissolved, but it no longer matters. We are the table now. I typed one word at the end. The same word I had typed in a different corridor, on a different station, when the galaxy was watching and expecting us to fail. Received. I sent it. Then I turned off the pad and walked back toward the ring. The flags were still hanging. The stars were still turning. The work was not done, it would never be done, but the work was good. The river continues. We continue. That is enough. That is everything. 10 years after the vote, The Galactic Council held its last session. Attendance was sparse. Fewer than half the recognized species bothered to send delegates. The Veth Dominion sat alone in their elevated tier, looking down at empty seats. Councillor Thavik had died 3 years earlier. His successor gave a speech about the importance of tradition. The speech was transmitted to an audience of approximately 12, mostly recording devices and automated translation units. The Council did not formally dissolve. It simply stopped mattering. The Alliance of Independent Worlds had become the primary body for interstellar cooperation, and the Alliance did not have tiers or classifications or 40-year waiting periods. It had a ring of identical seats and a rule that anyone who wanted to speak could speak. Earth's delegation to the Alliance had grown to 6 people. I was not among them. I had retired the previous year, turning my seat over to a woman named Soraya, the same young aide who had once asked me about the strategy. She was 32 now, sharp and steady, with the kind of patience that came from growing up in the Alliance rather than fighting to build it. "You'll do fine," I told her on her first day. "I know," she said. "You built the room. I just have to sit in it." I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came easily now, not the sharp, startled laugh of recognition, but something warmer. Something that had been waiting for years to be used. I live in a small house on the northern coast of England, near the port town where my grandmother Helen spent her final years. The sea is grey most days, but the light is good. I grow vegetables in the garden, tomatoes, mostly, which is ironic because I do not particularly like tomatoes. But they grow well here, and watching something grow is its own kind of satisfaction. Helen died 4 years ago. She was 103. On her last day, she asked me to tell her about the Alliance. I told her about the ring of seats, the flags from 63 species, the Marith delegate who had voted no when everyone else voted yes. She listened with her eyes closed, nodding at the right moments. "Good," she said. "That's good." Then she opened her eyes and looked at me. "You were never small," she said. "You just had to grow where they couldn't see you." She died that night. I planted tomatoes in her garden the next spring. The card from the Marith delegate sits on my mantelpiece, next to a photograph of Webb and a small fragment of the folding table that Earth's delegation had used on Convergence Point Station. The table had been scheduled for disposal after the reclassification vote. I had kept it. It sits in my shed now, the metal legs rusted, the surface scratched and stained. I do not look at it often. But I know it is there. Sometimes, on clear nights, I walk down to the shore and watch the stars. The station where the Alliance meets is not visible from here. It orbits a star with no name, in a sector of space that was once considered worthless by the old Council. But I know where it is. I helped choose the coordinates. We picked a place that belonged to no one, because belonging to no one meant belonging to everyone. The galaxy is large. It took us a long time to find our place in it. But we found it, not by asking permission, not by waiting for recognition, but by building something that could not be ignored. The Alliance is not perfect. It argues constantly, moves slowly, and occasionally produces documents that are longer than they need to be. But it works. And the reason it works is the same reason the old Council failed, because every species in it has been told at some point that they were not ready, not recognized, not rational enough to sit at the table. They built the table themselves. They sit at it every day. I am old now. My hands shake when I pour tea, and my knees ache in cold weather. But I remember the corridor. I remember the soundproofing screen. I remember the word received, typed into a pad in a place where no one looked at me. I remember what it felt like to be dismissed, and what it felt like to build something that would make dismissal impossible. The river continues. We continue. That is enough. That is everything.